A cold wind swept through the busy streets as people hurried along, lost in their own lives. In a quiet corner near a rundown gas station, a homeless man sat on a piece of cardboard, wrapped in an old, tattered blanket. Beside him, his only companion, a small, scruffy dog, curled up against his side, seeking warmth. The man gently stroked the dog's fur, whispering softly to it. They had been together for years, surviving on kindness, sharing scraps of food, and finding comfort in each other's presence. To him, this dog was not just a pet, it was family. Across the street, a group of bikers pulled up outside a cafe. Their motorcycles roared loudly, drawing attention. Among them was a man named Jake, known for his mean streak and love for causing trouble. He was the type who thrived on power, enjoying the way people feared him. As he stepped off his bike, his eyes landed on the homeless man and his dog. A smirk formed on his face. He nudged his friend. "Watch this," he said, chuckling darkly. Without warning, Jake walked straight up to the dog and kicked it hard. The small animal yelped in pain, rolling across the cold pavement. The homeless man gasped, scrambling toward his dog, his eyes filled with fear and pain. "What did you do that for?" he cried, pulling his trembling dog into his arms. The little creature whimpered, licking the man's face as if trying to comfort him. Instead, Jake laughed cruelly. "Filthy stray," he muttered. "Just like its owner." What Jake didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Keanu Reeves was watching, sitting inside a small cafe just a few feet away. Keanu had witnessed everything. He had been quietly sipping his coffee, enjoying a rare moment of peace, but the second he saw that kick, something inside him burned with anger. He placed his cup down slowly, took a deep breath, and stood up. "Hey there, before we dive back into the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got another amazing story coming your way tomorrow." Keanu walked out of the cafe, his footsteps calm and steady. His long coat fluttered slightly in the wind as he made his way toward the scene. The homeless man was still cradling his dog, whispering words of comfort, his hands shaking. Jake, meanwhile, was still laughing with his friends. "Did you see how far that thing rolled?" he sneered. "Pathetic." Keanu's voice cut through the air, quiet but firm. "That wasn't funny." The laughter stopped. The group of bikers turned their heads, their amused expressions fading when they recognized the man standing before them. Jake squinted. "Wait a minute. Aren't you?" Keanu ignored the question. His sharp gaze locked onto Jake's. "You think it makes you strong to hurt those weaker than you?" he asked, his voice calm, but laced with an intensity that made Jake's throat tighten. Jake's cocky smirk returned, though there was a slight hesitation in his posture. "Relax, man. It's just a dog." Keanu's jaw tightened. "No," he said. "It's not just a dog. It's his family. His only friend. And you hurt it for no reason." Jake shifted uncomfortably. His friends glanced at each other, sensing the sudden shift in energy. People were starting to watch. Keanu crouched down beside the homeless man, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Is your dog okay?" he asked softly. The man nodded, though his eyes were still filled with tears. I think so." Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed the man a thick bundle of cash. "Take him to a vet," he said. "Make sure he's okay. And get yourself something warm to eat." The homeless man's eyes widened in disbelief. I can't take this," Keanu smiled warmly. "Of course, you can. You and your little friend deserve kindness." Jake scoffed. "Oh, come on. You're really gonna waste money on that?" Keanu stood up again, this time stepping closer to Jake, his face unreadable. "You think money is what makes a person valuable?" he asked. You think having a bike and a gang makes you better than him? Jake swallowed hard. The atmosphere had shifted completely. His friends were no longer laughing. Keanu exhaled, shaking his head. I've met some of the richest people in the world, he said. And you know what? Some of them have nothing in their hearts. No kindness. No empathy. They think power comes from making others feel small. His gaze darkened. But real strength? Real power? That comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. Jake clenched his fists, but for the first time in a long time, he had no words. Keanu took another step forward. So tell me, Jake. Do you feel powerful right now? The silence was deafening. People were still watching. Jake felt their stares like daggers, burning through his tough exterior. For the first time, he saw himself through their eyes, not as a leader, not as someone to be feared, but as a bully. His throat felt dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of Keanu's words crushed every excuse before it could leave his lips. Keanu held his gaze for a few more seconds, then turned to the homeless man again. Take care of yourself, he said kindly. And your little friend. The man nodded, his eyes still glistening with emotion. Thank you. Thank you so much. Keanu nodded, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the city streets like a shadow. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring about what they had just witnessed. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding. His friends shifted awkwardly beside him, unsure of what to say. One of them muttered, "Dude, that was Keanu Reeves." Jake knew it didn't matter who it was. What mattered was what he had done. Later that night, Jake sat alone, replaying the moment over and over in his head. The look in Keanu's eyes. The shame that had burned in his own chest. The realization that, for the first time, he wasn't the strongest person in the room, not because Keanu was famous, not because he was rich, but because Keanu had something Jake didn't. A heart. The next morning, Jake did something he never thought he would do. He walked down the same street where the homeless man had been. This time, he didn't come with cruelty in his heart. Instead, he came with a blanket, some food, and an apology. The homeless man looked up, surprised. Jake hesitated, then slowly sat down beside him, placing the food and blanket between them. I was a jerk, Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. I shouldn't have done that. The man looked at him for a long moment, then smiled softly. People can change, he said simply. Jake nodded, and for the first time in his life, he felt something stronger than power. He felt human, because kindness, as Keanu had shown him, was the greatest strength of all. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Jake sat in silence beside the homeless man, feeling the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. He had spent years believing that toughness meant making others fear him, that strength came from power and dominance. But in reality, it had only left him empty. The homeless man took a small bite of the sandwich Jake had brought, chewing slowly. His dog, now bandaged and safe, rested peacefully in his lap, occasionally wagging its tail. Jake cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the quiet. What's his name? He asked, nodding toward the dog. The man smiled. Lucky. Jake smirked slightly. Guess that fits. The man chuckled softly. He's been through a lot. But he never stops loving. Never stops trusting. He stroked the dog's fur gently. Sometimes, I think he's got more heart than most people. Jake stared at the small creature, remembering the way it had licked the man's face, even after being kicked. Even after being hurt. I don't get it, Jake admitted after a moment. Why aren't you? I don't know, angry? If I were you, I'd hate me. The homeless man shook his head. Hate doesn't fix anything, he said simply. And I don't have room for it in my heart. Jake exhaled slowly. He had spent his whole life building walls, making sure no one could ever see his weakness. But this man, someone who had nothing, was stronger than him in ways he had never understood. The sound of approaching footsteps made Jake look up. His biker friends stood across the street, watching him with confusion and mild amusement. One of them, a tall guy with tattoos up his arms, smirked. "What are you doing, man? Making best friends with the hobo?" Jake clenched his jaw. A part of him wanted to snap back, to prove he was still the same guy they feared. But something held him back. That he looked at the homeless man. Looked at Lucky, then, with a deep breath, he stood up and turned toward his old crew. "Yeah," he said simply. "I am." Silence. Then laughter. One of them shook his head. "Wow. Keanu really got into your head, huh?" Jake didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the street, remembering those sharp, steady eyes, how Keanu had seen right through him. It wasn't about Keanu Reeves being famous. It was about what he represented: kindness, strength, something Jake had never really understood. He looked back at his old crew and exhaled. "Yeah," he admitted. "Maybe he did." The group scoffed, muttering among themselves before walking off, leaving Jake standing there alone. And for the first time, he didn't mind, because for the first time in his life, he felt free. Days passed, then weeks. Life moved on, as it always did. But Jake wasn't the same. He didn't return to his biker gang. The idea of spending his days proving something to people who didn't care about him didn't make sense anymore. Instead, he found himself coming back to that street corner, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He brought food. He brought blankets. He even helped find a local shelter that welcomed Lucky and his owner, and slowly, change took root. One afternoon, Jake arrived at the corner only to find it empty. No sign of the homeless man. No sign of Lucky. His chest tightened. Had something happened? Then, a voice called out from behind, "You won't find him there anymore." Jake turned to see a kind-looking woman standing by the door of a small community center. "He's inside," she continued. "Got himself a job helping around here." Jake blinked. "A job?" She nodded. "Keanu made some calls. Found someone willing to help him get back on his feet." Jake felt a warmth spread in his chest. Keanu hadn't just walked away that day, he had followed through, making sure the man and his dog got a second chance. Jake hesitated for only a moment before walking inside, and there, standing by a table, handing out food to others in need, was the homeless man. He looked up, spotted Jake, and grinned. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Jake shrugged, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Guess I'm full of surprises." Lucky barked happily at his feet, tail wagging, and for the first time, Jake smiled, a real smile, because this was the kind of strength he wanted to have. And it had taken a moment of cruelty, a lesson from a stranger, and the kindness of Keanu Reeves to help him finally see it. Jake took a slow breath, looking around the community center. The place was simple: rows of tables, stacks of donated clothes, volunteers moving back and forth, handing out food and offering warm smiles. It wasn't much, but it was real. It was good. The homeless man, no, Daniel, as Jake finally learned his name, set down a tray and walked over. Lucky trotted beside him, his tail wagging like they were old friends. "I owe you a thanks," Daniel said, giving Jake a small smile. "Not just for the food that day, but for listening." Jake shook his head. "Nah, man. I should be thanking you. You and your little guy here." He bent down, scratching Lucky behind the ears. The small dog licked his fingers happily, no longer fearful. Daniel chuckled. "I knew there was some good in you," he said, crossing his arms. "Even when you kicked the food over, even when you walked off like you owned the world. I saw it." Jake scoffed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah? I didn't. Daniel shrugged. We don't always see ourselves clearly. Sometimes, it takes someone else to open our eyes. Jake knew who he meant, Keanu. The name still lingered in his mind like an echo. Jake had spent his whole life proving something, his strength, his power, his place in the world. But Keanu hadn't needed power to put him in his place. He hadn't needed anger, fists, or threats, just words. Just kindness. Jake hadn't realized until now how much strength that actually took. His biker gang had always taught him that weakness was in softness. That kindness was just another way to get stepped on. But Keanu had been different. He had power, but he didn't use it to hurt people, and that had changed everything. Jake exhaled, stuffing his hands into his pockets. So, what's next for you? He asked Daniel. Daniel smiled, glancing around the community center. I think I'm gonna stay here for a while. They're letting me help out, and, he patted Lucky's head. We've got a place to sleep now. Feels nice. Jake nodded. He didn't know why, but something about that answer felt right. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, not uncomfortable. Just quiet understanding. Finally, Jake shifted on his feet. Well, I should head out, he muttered. Got some stuff to figure out. Daniel grinned. That's code for I'm not done changing yet, isn't it? Jake smirked. Something like that. As he turned to leave, he felt something brush against his leg. Looking down, he saw Lucky sitting at his feet, staring up at him with big, hopeful eyes. Jake hesitated, then crouched down, scratching behind the dog's ears. Take care of your old man, all right, he murmured. Lucky barked softly, as if he understood. Daniel laughed. I think he likes you. Jake stood up, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, well, guess I ain't so bad after all. He took a step toward the door, then paused. Hey, he said over his shoulder. Tell Keanu, thanks. Daniel's smile widened. Something tells me he already knows. Jake chuckled. Maybe he did. Maybe Keanu hadn't just seen him that day. Maybe Keanu had known exactly what he was doing. Helping people wasn't just about giving them food, shelter, or money. Sometimes, it was about showing them who they could be. Jake pushed open the door, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The sun felt different on his skin. The world felt lighter, and for the first time in his life, he didn't need power to feel strong, because now, he understood what real strength was, and it had nothing to do with fear. It had everything to do with kindness.